Hey, everybody. So I'm going to talk today about one of the hardest things that I've had to learn over the past several years as I've been speaking out more and more publicly as specifically a retired evangelical pastor, speaking out against Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. I'm going to be talking about a belief system that might seem obviously off base to a lot of my listeners from the outside, but I think that it's so deeply ingrained into the conservative Christian movement in America that I think it's almost invisible to many of the people who believe it. And for me to speak against it almost sounds like I don't know how to read my Bible to some of those people. But this isn't only for people who would call yourselves Christians, because I think everyone needs to understand what's going on in these right-wing churches across the country. So even if you're a non-Christian who listens to me, as I know a lot of you are, or if you're a follower of Jesus who tends to vote for the Democrats or independents, I think it's still important to figure out why such a huge percentage of white evangelicals, for instance, continue to support candidates who might claim the mantle of being like the Christian candidate, but then they defile the name of Jesus every day through their words and actions. And I don't think we can understand why so many Christians would sell their birthright to conmen and grifters and why they would sell it so cheap unless we understand Christian authoritarianism. And the hard truth, one that it's taken me years to learn since I retired from pastoral ministry and started interacting with Christian Trump supporters kind of across the nation, the hard truth I've learned is that a very high percentage of people who call themselves believers are locked into a view of authority that's just grossly opposed to the teaching of Jesus. And I don't think our nation is going to get better long term unless the Christians in the nation get a better understanding of biblical authority. But I'm going to talk about a survey here that also has a message, I think, for Democrats who might want to, win some elections. I think that you need to understand that the United States is just kind of an authoritarian nation in general, and it's not just the Christians who have some of these beliefs. When I go deep into this survey in a few minutes, I think maybe you'll understand also why Kristi Noem's kind of sick and moronic messaging about immigration works, for instance. If you offer Americans a choice between a twisted dimwit who's doing something versus maybe a good-hearted, intelligent person who will talk an issue to death for years, Americans are going to pick the dimwit every time. And I'm not a Democrat. I'll be an independent for the rest of my life. I used to be a Republican, but I do want the Democrats to get better at listening to the people that I came from and to actually reach out to them. And I think there are ways to act a little more boldly and decisively that aren't corrupt and they aren't authoritarian, but they can scratch that itch that just your average American might have for doing something and letting the chips fall where they may. And that's one of the attractions of Trump, if I'm honest. I find nothing attractive about him, but I get that people who want to see somebody take action like that sort of thing. And that doesn't excuse anyone who voted for Trump 3 times now, and since the 2024 election, I've just seen how deep that authoritarian distortion goes in the Christian movement in America. I'm shocked that the rampant authoritarian abuses of the Trump administration are either being ignored or actively supported by so many people who call themselves followers of Jesus. So today, I'm not going to spend any time refuting the authoritarian distortion in the church. I make a lot of videos that deal with aspects of this, and I'm going to continue to do that. But for today, I just want to share one finding from this one survey that paints a clear picture of what I'm talking about. And then in my next video, we're going to look at all the findings from that survey. My goal today, though, is to show just how deep the sickness goes, because I think a lot of people get this wrong about the people who support Trump from the Christian world. I hear people who don't come from the white evangelical world or the white conservative Christian world who are missing this real authoritarian piece in their understanding of Trump's Christian supporters. I mean, sure, we know that some percentage of Trump supporters are driven exclusively by something like the abortion issue. Like, that's true, and I've spoken about that a lot. But every survey tells us that that's not the issue for most of his supporters. And I'll just say this again. Even if that is somebody's biggest issue, several candidates in the Republican primaries in 2024 had, if anything, more conservative positions on abortion than Trump did. And it was evangelicals who chose Trump over all of those other Republican candidates. The rest of the people in the Republican primaries didn't go for Trump, but it was conservative Christians and specifically white evangelicals who put him over the top. So why is that? What did evangelicals specifically see in Donald Trump that they didn't see in the other candidates? And I know a lot of people are going to want to just say it's Trump's racism and his bigotry. And I'll be the first to tell you that race does play a much larger role in evangelical support for the MAGA movement than most of them are going to want to admit. And I do talk about that a lot here too. And they do announce it out loud every time they make excuses for Trump and Kristi Noem's treatment of immigrants. But still, most of the Republican candidates in the primaries talked about immigration in kind of the same jingoistic sound bites. So what was different about Donald Trump that attracted specifically conservative Christians? What was it that caused them to put him over the top in important early states like Iowa and in South Carolina? It's not because they thought that he was a winner. They all thought that. It doesn't explain why evangelicals and other conservative Christians liked him more than the other Republican primary voters did. What set Trump apart for those conservative Christians was that he'd already demonstrated an authoritarian approach to leadership. And that's more than just acting boldly. Authoritarian leadership includes things like destroying the political institutions that might hold a leader in check, attacking educational institutions, attacking the idea of science or of any independent sources of knowledge. Evangelicals love those things about Trump. And they love the way that he asserted his dominance over women, if we're being honest. And that's another key authoritarian touchstone. And they love that he shamelessly promised to do his authoritarian stuff on their behalf. And that's why they wanted him back in power. And that's why they chose him over every other Republican candidate in the primaries. And that's why the thousands of comments that people have left on this channel by now, excusing their support for Trump by attacking the Democrats, is just a diversion from the point that I've been making all along. White conservative Christians in America have had their consciences seared by Donald Trump, as expected. And that's a bad thing for them, and it's a bad thing for the nation. And there are things deep inside the conservative Christian movement in America that are broken, that made them right picking for a corrupt authoritarian like Donald Trump. And this authoritarian way of looking at the scriptures is one of those big broken pieces. And no amount of blame shifting to the Democrats or to anyone else is going to change that sad truth about Christians. So I decided to talk about this today because this week I'm doing my sort of quarterly reassessment of what it is that I exactly do around here. And I've been wondering how best to help people understand some of these problems. So today, this is what I'm talking about. And I just want to spend the last few minutes of this video with this recent survey from 2024 that gets right at this issue. And it'll help us look at some categories. And as I talk about the individual questions, you can ask yourself how well you might fit into the authoritarian mindset based on these questions. And again, in the next video, I'll go deeper into more questions that they asked. And it'll all paint, I think, a clear picture of where the church in America is at. So the survey was conducted by PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. And you can find this online in their article, One Leader Under God, the connection between authoritarianism and Christian nationalism in America. And for today, I want to focus on just one part of the survey, which they call the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And they explain that the first version of this scale was developed in 1950 as a way of studying the rise of fascism that led to World War II. And then the scale was adapted in 1981 to its current form. And like everything in academic studies, of course, people are going to debate whether these are the exact right questions to ask. But for my purposes, they're perfect, as long as I show you the questions so you understand what we're talking about here. I'm not trying to find the most precise way of asking a question. I think the answers to these 4 questions that they did ask tell us a lot. So let me give you the top line result first before we look at the 4 individual questions. According to the article, right-wing authoritarian views are more prevalent among Republicans, particularly those who hold favorable views of Trump, white evangelical Protestants, and weekly churchgoers. 2/3 of Republicans score high on the right-wing authoritarian scale, compared with 35% of independents and 28% of Democrats. Republicans who hold favorable views of Trump are 36 percentage points more likely than those with unfavorable views of Trump to score high on that scale, which means the Republicans who showed up to the primaries who didn't vote for Trump are the ones who were not authoritarian. Here's the main one. White evangelical Protestants, 64%, are the religious group most likely to score high on this scale, followed by slim majorities of other Protestants of color, Hispanic Protestants, and white Catholics. A majority of the weekly churchgoers score high on the scale, compared with 44% of Americans who attend church a few times a year and 38% of those who never attend church services. So those are the top line numbers, and they paint a picture basically that the religious people in America are the more authoritarian ones. And so we'll go a lot deeper into those numbers in the next video. But for today, I think it's important to look at just those 4 questions that they ask and to see just how high Americans in general score on them. And for sure, a lot of that is explained by the sheer number of white Christians in America. But I was personally surprised by the number of people who do hold these views. So let's look at these statements. And the question for each of these statements is going to be, how much do you agree with this statement? So the first statement is this: the only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. And I just want to point out for each of these statements that these have been themes that authoritarian types have always believed. And if you point out that a certain personality type always believes the subversives are leading the country to a crisis, then they'll say, yeah, but this time it's really bad. But I digress. So for that statement, the only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. 53% of all Americans either completely agree with that statement or strongly agree. And again, conservative Christians account for a lot of those people. But if you wonder how Donald Trump can win and how people can support corrupt buffoons like Kristi Noem and Tom Homan, that one question goes a long way toward answering it. And it's my role to help Christians understand why this is not a good Christian approach to leadership. But again, I'd ask anyone who's trying to oppose the MAGA movement to at least understand this impulse in 53% of Americans and try to show them a better model for political leadership. So now here's the second statement. Our country will be destroyed someday if we do not smash the perversions eating away at our moral fiber and traditional beliefs. And 55% of all Americans either completely agree or mostly agree with that statement as of 2024. And again, I'll just say that every culture ever has had its people who get othered. People who are held up as the ones whose nonconformity to social or sexual norms is putting the whole moral fiber of the nation at risk. That's just always happened everywhere. And authoritarians have always seized on this sort of person to empower themselves. But that's not how Christians are called to live, to smash what we might consider other people's perversions. We're to focus on our own personal holiness, and most surveys will show that many Christians participate in the same activities everybody else does. They just lie about it. And when it comes to perversion, I personally can't imagine anything more perverse than to associate the name of Jesus with Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. But that's just me. So the third statement is this: what our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. And this is the statement that receives the highest support from Americans. 62% of all Americans either completely agree or mostly agree with that statement. So that's, wow. I mean, I think that's important. And again, with all the caveats about the hypocrisy of Christians supporting Trump and his goons and everything, this is just a stunning statement to me about America. And I think the reason it's so high is because people might have different definitions of evil, but Americans in recent years, at least, have gotten kind of radicalized against each other. And 62% of people are saying they want a champion to fight their battles and to crush the evil on the other side. So that's a major red flag to me. You know, it's the crushing evil thing that's got me concerned, because we've all seen how the Trump administration calls their opponents evil. And I hear it all the time in the comments on this channel. The Democrats, to a lot of these people, are no longer simply their neighbors who might add up their political choices differently. They see them as evil, and they say they need to be crushed. So that's a problem. And the fact that it's 62% of respondents shows it's not just the MAGA Republicans who believe that. So then this last statement is this: our country will be great if we honor the ways of our forefathers, do what the authorities tell us to do, and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything. And even though I'm embarrassed to even read that sentence out loud, 51% of all respondents either completely agree or mostly agree with that statement. So that's where we're at. And it's not just Christians who believe these things, but it's a lot of Christians. And as somebody who's pastored evangelical churches for a long time, I find it embarrassing that I didn't know that the problem went this deep. And I find it troubling beyond measure. And I'm committed to do my part on my little corner of the internet here to try to help Christians develop a more biblical understanding of authority and of our role in the world. And I just want to thank those of you who are doing this work yourselves in your own corners of the world. And thanks for listening.